The question is that the motion be agreed to. Claire Curran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, well, she came into the House, she delivered her first speech, and she said that this wasn't a tax, and she said that prices wouldn't go up, and she said that it was a mere extension to a levy. So what happened within 40 minutes is that prices were announced to go up by one of the major telcos, that they called it a tax, and they said it was unfair and there'd been no consultation. And the most important part of the release that they sent out is said that they are exploring options for adding this cost in a transparent way to our customers' monthly statements so they understand the contribution that they are making to the government's Telecommunications Development Levy Fund. Well, if that's not a demonstration of a new tax being imposed, then I don't know what is. And all I can say is that this government said it would introduce no new taxes, and it has. And this is the latest one, and it's going to go on everybody's phone and internet bills every month, and that's because this minister hasn't done her work. She hasn't consulted properly with the industry. She hasn't done an evaluation of the original rural broadband scheme. There is no evidence that it has been successful, despite what she says. Gets up and says the Internet New Zealand, who came before the Select Committee yesterday, said that we could expect more petitions from communities around New Zealand who have very bad broadband speeds and are desperate to try and change that, and that there was no evidence that had been provided. The Ministry, MB, told us the same thing. They said that there was no analysis. There was no analysis of the economic outputs or the benefits because it hasn't been done. And all we're hearing is that it's money that's been spent in rural New Zealand and it could be going down a big black hole. And here we are committing another $150 million of an industry levy that is directly being passed on to consumers. Oh, the minister scoffed at me when I said that. But what happened? It's being directly passed on to consumers. Mr. English, an extra dollar a month on every consumer's phone and internet bills as a direct result of a piece of legislation that's going through under urgency. That's a result. That's a result. Whether it's a good result or a bad result is another matter. I call it a bad result. But a result that's going to put an extra dollar. So you give $25 and you take away $1, and you put the government has introduced 3 new taxes during this budget. I'd say that's the government and Amy Adams has got egg on their face. Egg on their face. And I'd also say to the National Party MPs in the House right now who are living in rural electorates, you would know, they would know, Mr. Speaker, they would know that they are having constant, particularly in Stuart Smith and Kaikoura and Barbara Kruger are 2 that I know of, who are having steady streams of constituents coming in from rural New Zealand and saying that the quality of their broadband is inadequate and please do something about it. I would imagine that there are many other rural MPs who are saying the same. Well, I say to them that this legislation, which commits $150 million of a levy on industry being directly passed on to consumers, is not going to make it better. It's not going to make it better because the first scheme has not been evaluated. There's no evidence that said it's worked. In fact, the information that we are getting is saying that it absolutely hasn't. And let me give you some examples. Mr. Speaker, there's been a road trip undertaken by a group which calls itself Hills, Holes and Poles, which is a project which is part funded by Internet New Zealand, which has been touring the country over the last few months in rural and regional New Zealand, looking at the quality of broadband experience that people are having. What they are finding is that for many rural Kiwis, broadband remains frustratingly out of reach or unaffordable, which is despite successive government policies, including the Rural Broadband Initiative. So what they are finding instead are communities that are doing it for themselves. They aren't using the Rural Broadband Scheme. They are coming up with community initiatives with local wireless providers to actually form with trusts and with providers to actually form their own community wireless schemes. And they are doing, in some of the communities, really well. But this is not Amy Adams's initiative. This is not what she gets up and trumpets in the House about, and there's dozens and dozens of them, and more are happening, but they're doing it themselves. What Labor would have done would have been to support them to do it themselves better and faster. Instead, we're having imposed a government-imposed levy, which will be passed on to consumers, a tax which is not going to deliver. And that is the great tragedy of this, Mr. Speaker. Even the ministry involved acknowledges that the work hasn't been done, that there's been no evaluation, it can't be evaluated, therefore it can't be decided whether or not it's a good idea to invest the extra $150 million. The most innovative rural broadband is happening, as I said, in communities around New Zealand, and there's one happening in mid-Canterbury, which is ironically right next to the Minister's electorate. Maybe she should go and visit that. So one of the problems with the Telecommunications Development Levy, which is highlighted in the regulatory impact statement, and is the expectation by the major payers, that the funds will in large be recycled back through them. And I note that the Green Party have introduced some 2 SOPs, which the Labor Party will be pleased to support during the progress of this bill through the committee stages. And we'll be keen to debate those SOPs and what the impacts are, because one of the issues that lies behind the lack of evaluation, the lack of economic analysis in this legislation is knowing whether or not that the recycling of funds back into the big players, such as Vodafone and Chorus, have actually, in effect, ended up being a subsidy to those players that have enabled them to entrench their status out in rural New Zealand. Now, you know, I'm not making that assertion in the House tonight, Mr. Speaker, but I'm asking the question. And the problem is that we don't have the answers because we haven't been able to have the analysis about this very matter, and that is a great shame. Another example of what communities are doing for themselves is in Marlborough. The Marlborough District Council has just done a survey, has just managed a survey of 700 people, or 700 people have responded to their online survey on connectivity, which is a very high response for a community. As I understand, it's 4 times the number of people who have engaged in the long-term district plan process, Mr. Speaker, which indicates that there's a high degree of interest out there in rural New Zealand. And I challenge that any of the National Party MPs who have got rural parts of their constituencies that are rural to tell the House that they don't have people coming into their offices on a constant basis or writing to them about the state of their rural broadband. Colmar Brunton's done done a survey. They have come up with the figure of 68% of rural businesses and households in New Zealand that are angry and frustrated about the state of their broadband. After nearly 5 years of the first scheme, you'd think that things would be better than that. And now they're introducing another $150 million for a failed scheme.
Melissa